There's a small house in a farm town almost no one has ever heard of, where 8 people, 6 members of one family, plus 2 neighbor kids sleeping over, were killed in a single night with their own family's wood-splitting axe. No gunshots. No screams anyone ever heard. When the bodies were discovered the next morning, the killer had vanished without a trace, and more than 110 years later, he's never been caught. This isn't some forgotten, isolated case. This is the case that permanently changed how America investigates crime, that destroyed the career of a state senator, that put a minister on trial twice, and, according to a startling theory published less than a decade ago, may have been just one of dozens of nearly identical massacres committed by the same man, making him one of the bloodiest serial killers in American history that almost nobody has ever heard of. This is Villisca, Iowa. If you're listening to relax, just let the voice carry you along naturally. This is the second oldest case in the Marked series. It happened in 1912, 20 years after the Lizzie Borden case we told you about last episode. But unlike Borden, there was no single lead suspect brought to trial and acquitted here. Here, almost no one was ever convincingly charged at all, and that's exactly what has made this case haunt America for more than a century. In 1912, Villisca was a small farming town in southwestern Iowa, with a population of only about 2,500. It was the textbook early 20th century American Midwest town. A central square, a handful of churches, a small train depot serving the local grain trade, and streets where nearly everyone knew everyone else's face, name, and occupation. It was the kind of community where doors were rarely locked, where kids could run freely from house to house without anyone worrying, and where a Sunday evening at church was still the most important social event of the community's week. The Moore family lived in a modest 1.5-story wood frame house, just a few minutes' walk from the town square. Josiah B. Moore, the head of the household, was a successful man by local standards. He'd worked for years at a farm equipment store in town before breaking off to open his own competing shop, a decision that would come back to haunt this story in a way no one could have predicted. He married Sarah Montgomery on December 6, 1899, and by 1912 the couple had 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, the youngest, at 5. The Moore family was known around town as kind, generous, and on good terms with nearly everyone. They were active members of the local Presbyterian church. Sarah was even one of the main organizers of the church's children's programs. Herman, the 11-year-old eldest, was remembered by neighbors as a steady, responsible boy who always helped his parents with farm chores. Catherine, 10, was close friends with both Lena and Ina Stillinger, constantly running back and forth between houses after school. Boyd, 7, and Paul, the 5-year-old youngest, were still at the age of sticking close to their mother, not yet in school full-time. But behind that picture-perfect family image, Josiah also had no shortage of people who disliked him, both personally and in business, something that would later become one of the most important threads in the case, even though it never led to a conviction that stuck. Small as it was, Villisca had all the trappings of a typical growing Midwestern town. 2 competing local newspapers, a handful of general stores along the town square, and a rail line connecting it to larger cities in the region. A seemingly minor detail that, as we'll see, turns out to be absolutely central to one of the most startling theories about this case, many years later. About 7 miles from the Moore house, on a farm on the edge of town, lived the Stillinger family, another well-off local family with close ties to the Moores through church. The 2 Stillinger girls, Lena, about 11 or 12 at the time, and Ina, just 8, were close with Catherine Moore and played together often, exactly like any group of kids growing up together in a small town where everyone knew everyone. The Stillingers had an older daughter, Blanche, already a teenager at the time, who often looked after her younger sisters whenever their parents were busy with farm work. On Sunday, June 9, 1912, the town's newly built Presbyterian church held a special evening Children's Day program, an event Sarah Moore helped organize, with the whole Moore family attending, along with a large number of other local children performing small pieces, recitations, hymns, short religious-themed skits for kids. Lena and Ina Stillinger were there too, taking part in the program alongside Catherine, likely having rehearsed their piece together for weeks beforehand, eager for their turn to perform in front of their parents and the whole community. The program ended around 9:30 p.m. Earlier, around 6 p.m., Josiah had called the Stillinger house, asking the girl's older sister Blanche whether Lena and Ina could sleep over at the Moore house that night. A completely ordinary request, the kind of sleepover any kid in a small town like Villisca went through more times than they could count. The Stillingers agreed without hesitation. There was no reason not to, in a town where every family knew every other family, where the very concept of danger lurking in the dark had almost never crossed any parent's mind. After the program ended, the Moore family and the two Stillinger girls walked home under the Iowa summer night sky, arriving sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. They were probably still chattering about the performance, who forgot their lines, who did the best job, the completely ordinary chatter of kids after a completely ordinary evening, none of them with the faintest sense of what was coming. That was the last time anyone still living ever saw all 8 of them alive. What happened after that, investigators could only reconstruct from the crime scene and the autopsy results, because not one of the 8 people in that house that night lived to tell it. Many investigators believe the killer had already slipped into the house earlier, possibly hiding in the attic, patiently waiting in the dark until the whole family fell into a deep sleep. Some early investigative records mention 2 cigarette butts found in the attic as evidence that he'd waited there for hours, though tour guides at the museum today insist no cigarette evidence was ever officially recorded. One of several points where the folklore and the original case file don't quite line up more than a century later. The first medical examiner on the scene, Dr. F.S. Williams, later determined the attack took place sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. The killer picked up the Moore family's own axe and began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah lay sleeping. Josiah received more blows than any of the 8 victims, possibly as many as 30, with enough force that his face was almost unrecognizable, both eyes completely destroyed. The ceiling above his bed still bore deep gouge marks, left by the upswing of the axe before each blow. After finishing off the couple, the killer moved into the adjoining room, where the 4 more children lay sleeping, and worked through each of them in turn. Finally, he went downstairs to the parlor, where the 2 Stillinger sisters were sleeping in the guest bed, and finished with the last 2 victims. One detail makes all 8 deaths even more haunting than any casualty count could convey. According to many investigators, after killing all 8 people, the killer went back upstairs to the Moore family's bedroom once more, continuing to swing the axe at bodies that were already dead, an act that seemingly served no practical purpose at all, beyond pure rage, or some kind of disturbed ritual belonging only to the killer himself. Only one victim showed any sign of having woken and tried to fight back. Lena Stillinger, the older of the 2 sisters. Her body was found in a different position from the other victims, with a blood stain on her knee and a wound on her arm that many investigators believe was a defensive wound, suggesting that, for a few brief seconds at least, she'd realized something was happening and tried to protect herself before it was over. By 7 a.m. on June 10th, Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, started to feel uneasy. It was well past the hour when the Moore family usually came outside to do their morning chores, feeding the chickens, opening the coop, the small daily tasks any farm family did without fail. She knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the door and found it locked from the inside. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out of their coop, then called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, who lived nearby. Ross knocked too, called out his brother's name, and got no response either. Finally, he used his own key to unlock the front door and stepped inside, while Peckham waited on the porch. Ross walked through the parlor and opened the door to the downstairs guest bedroom, and found the bodies of the 2 Stillinger sisters on the bed. He immediately turned back and told Peckham to call Hank Horton, the town marshal, who arrived at the scene just minutes later. When Horton searched the whole house, he discovered the true scale of what had happened. Not just the 2 Stillinger girls, but all 6 members of the Moore family were dead too. all struck with the blunt end of the axe, not the blade, until they died. The axe itself, still bloody, was found in the parlor where the Stillinger sisters lay, not in the master bedroom where the attack began, suggesting the killer had carried it with him through all 3 rooms, only leaving it behind once everything was finished. Beyond the sheer brutality of the crime, it's the small, strange details at the scene that have haunted the public imagination for more than a century since. Details that don't seem to serve any practical purpose, but that hint at some kind of ritual, some disturbed logic belonging only to the killer, one no investigator has ever truly cracked. Every curtain in the house had been drawn shut, even though there was no one outside that night who could have looked in. Several mirrors in the house, according to multiple accounts, had been covered or turned to face the wall, a behavior some criminal psychologists interpret as a killer who didn't want to see his own reflection after what he'd done, though this remains speculation. A plate of raw bacon was found on the kitchen table, along with a bowl of water. No one has ever explained why they were there, or whether the killer stopped to eat or wash his hands right after the murders. A box of face powder had been knocked onto the floor. The victim's clothes were found folded unusually neatly over a few chairs, as though someone, victim or killer, had carefully tidied up, either before everything happened or right after. Both the front and back doors were found locked from the inside when Ross Moore arrived, meaning that, somehow, the killer had left the house while still managing to lock the door behind him, a level of composure that's chilling to imagine, immediately after committing one of the most savage massacres in Iowa history. Most notably, all 8 victims were found with their heads covered by cloth or bedding, an act many modern criminologists see as an important piece of forensic psychology. It suggests that even a killer capable of this level of brutality still felt something about directly facing the victims' faces afterward, a detail that becomes enormously important later, when we get to the most startling theory about this case. News of the massacre spread through Villisca within hours, and the community's reaction shifted almost immediately from shock to collective panic. If a beloved family, living right in the heart of town, could be wiped out entirely inside their own home without anyone noticing, then the simple logic of fear told every resident of Villisca that it could happen to anyone, at any time. In the nights that followed, people started locking their doors more carefully than ever. Many families chose to gather together overnight rather than stay alone, and no small number of residents began carrying weapons, even just walking around town during the day. The funeral for the Moore family and the 2 Stillinger sisters was held on June 12, 1912, right in the town square, a massive event drawing thousands of people from across the region, with a funeral procession of 50 carriages, and the National Guard called in to manage the crowds along the route. The investigation into the Villisca case fell into literal chaos from the very first days. The crime scene, which should have been strictly protected by modern criminal investigation standards, was instead swarmed by hundreds of curious onlookers on the very first day, many of whom even took small items from the house as souvenirs, permanently destroying much of the physical evidence a modern investigation could otherwise have used. The case dragged on for nearly a decade of investigation, one grand jury hearing after another, a sensational slander lawsuit, and at least 2 criminal trials, but none of it ever produced a final conviction. The case even directly influenced public policy. It was one of the driving forces behind the creation of what would become the modern Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, after lawmakers recognized that local police at the time were simply not equipped to handle a case this complex. Over time, 3 main lines of suspicion emerged more clearly than the rest, each with passionate supporters, and none ever fully ruled out. The first suspect, and perhaps the only one ever actually brought to criminal trial, was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a history of strange, troubling behavior and, according to many who knew him, a disturbing fixation on young girls. Kelly was a controversial figure even before the murders. He'd been dismissed or quietly cut off by several different congregations over behavior considered odd, sometimes alarming, particularly a tendency toward excessive closeness with the young girls in whatever congregation he was serving. Kelly was in Villisca the very night of the murders. and is believed to have attended the Children's Day service itself, alongside the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters, just hours before they were killed. And according to some witnesses, he left town on the earliest train the next morning, before the bodies were even discovered. Years later, not until 1917, 5 years after the tragedy, under hours of sustained interrogation from police and a private detective specifically hired to pursue the case, Kelly finally gave a detailed confession, describing the entire crime. But shortly afterward, he retracted the whole statement, insisting he was completely innocent and accusing police of using coercive interrogation tactics, including depriving him of sleep for days on end, to force him to say what they wanted to hear, a tactic that wasn't uncommon in the early 20th century American justice system, when the concept of suspects' rights was still in its infancy. Many modern researchers, looking back at the case file, also lean toward the possibility that the confession was extracted under overwhelming psychological pressure, rather than reflecting the truth, a phenomenon modern forensic psychology calls a false confession, which tends to happen to psychologically vulnerable individuals, subjected to relentless, prolonged interrogation. Kelly was tried twice. His first trial, in 1917, ended with a hung jury, the majority leaning toward acquittal, but not enough for the unanimous verdict required. His second trial, held later that same year, ended in a full acquittal. He was released and spent the rest of his life under the shadow of public suspicion, moving away from Iowa entirely, though he was never formally convicted of anything connected to the 8 deaths in Villisca. The second line of suspicion, perhaps the one that shook Iowa politics the hardest, centered on Frank F. Jones, a powerful state senator who also happened to be Josiah Moore's former employer, before Moore broke away to open his own competing farm equipment shop. The business relationship between the two men had ended bitterly, and there was plenty of talk around town about simmering jealousy and resentment between Jones and his former employee turned direct competitor. From the very first days after the bodies were discovered, community suspicion fell almost immediately on Jones. Public pressure intense enough that, even though no direct evidence was ever produced, it was enough to permanently destroy his political career and personal reputation for the rest of his life. Some members of the victims' families, including Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, and the Stillinger girls' own father, remained convinced Jones was behind the murders, in one way or another, for the rest of their lives. This theory also led to another branch of investigation, when a private detective was hired to track down a man named William Blackie Mansfield, on the suspicion that Jones might have hired him to carry out the murders. But when actual payroll records were checked, they showed Mansfield had been working hundreds of miles away, in Illinois, at the exact time of the murders, and he was released for lack of evidence. For more than a century, the Villisca case was treated as an isolated mystery, a horrific but localized tragedy, confined to one small Iowa town. But in 2017, a book called The Man from the Train, co-written by renowned baseball statistician Bill James and his daughter, Rachel McCarthy James, proposed a theory that forced an entire rethinking of the case. Using meticulous data analysis, Bill James's specialty as a sports statistician, the father-daughter team combed through thousands of old newspaper archives across the country and found a startling pattern. Between 1898 and 1912, dozens of families across America, from Oregon to Texas, from Kansas to Georgia, even in Canada, had been massacred inside their own homes in an eerily consistent pattern. Attacked at night, killed with the family's own axe, always struck with the blunt end rather than the blade, cash and jewelry left untouched even in plain sight, victims' faces often covered after death, and almost always, the victim's house was within walking distance of a train station. To get a sense of the scale of this pattern, consider a few cases the Jameses pieced together. In 1911, in Colorado Springs, an entire family was axed to death in their home, with nothing stolen. That same year, in a small Kansas town, another family met the same fate, following the same nighttime attack, victim's own axe pattern. Earlier still, in 1909 in Louisiana and in 1906 in Alabama, similar cases occurred but were never connected to one another simply because no early 20th century investigative agency had any way to compare crime data across states thousands of miles apart. According to the James's theory, the man behind this nearly decade-and-a-half-long killing spree, potentially more than 100 victims in total, which would make him one of the bloodiest serial killers in American history, far surpassing even far more infamous names like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy in body count, was a German immigrant named Paul Mueller. According to descriptions researchers pieced together, Mueller was short, stocky, with unusually small, widely spaced teeth, believed to have worked seasonally as a lumberjack, moving from logging camp to logging camp by hopping freight trains, earning a living through manual labor for a few months at a time before moving on again, which lines up with the fact that most of the murders attributed to him occurred near logging areas or rail lines. What makes this theory especially credible, according to many criminologists and true crime writers, is the historical context of early 20th century law enforcement itself. Local police at the time had virtually no way to communicate or share information across counties, let alone states. There was no national crime database, no dedicated telegraph network for police use, no concept of comparing a modus operandi across geographically distant cases. The very idea of a wandering stranger, moving constantly, attacking families he'd never met, and vanishing before the bodies were even found, barely existed in the investigative thinking of the time. Almost every case defaulted to assuming the killer had to be someone who knew the victims, which is exactly why investigators across the country, case after case, kept zeroing in on local suspects like Reverend Kelly or Senator Jones, while the real killer, if this theory holds, quietly boarded the next train and vanished from Iowa forever, just hours after the crime. The Jameses also point to another notable lead. A man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Villisca victims, was convicted in Missouri of axe murdering his own mother and grandmother just months after the Villisca killings, though he was never charged in the Iowa case. Some researchers once considered the possibility that Henry Lee Moore himself was the man from the train, before the Jameses built a case pointing more decisively toward Paul Mueller, based on matching the geographic range and timeline of the entire string of murders. The Jameses theory also offers a haunting explanation for the detail we mentioned earlier, the victims' faces being covered after death. Based on their analysis of similar cases with more surviving evidence, they argue the killer's deeper motive may have involved a disturbed sexual fixation on prepubescent girls, and that the rest of each family, including parents and siblings, were killed simply because they stood between him and his actual intended target. If that's true, the detail about Lena Stillinger, the only victim who showed signs of resistance, whose nightgown was found pushed up despite doctors at the time concluding there was no sign of sexual assault by the forensic standards of the day, carries a far more painful layer of meaning than the public of 1912 could have understood or openly acknowledged. Writer Harold Schechter, one of America's most respected authors on the history of true crime, has said, "The man from the train offers the most plausible explanation yet proposed for the Villisca case, a significant endorsement from within the field, though the book itself has also faced no shortage of skepticism from other researchers, who argue that linking dozens of scattered cases into a single chain, based solely on similarities in method, remains more speculative than hard forensic proof." It's worth stressing, this remains a theory, an elaborately constructed one, and one many crime researchers consider the most convincing explanation yet offered for Villisca, but a theory nonetheless. It has never been, and likely never will be, proven with absolute certainty. Paul Mueller, if he really existed and really was the killer, was never caught, never left a confession, and died long ago, taking that secret to his grave. The Villisca case left a strange legacy for American law enforcement. The chaos of the initial investigation, from the crime scene being trampled by curious crowds, to the complete absence of a professional state-level criminal investigation agency capable of coordinating across jurisdictions, became one of the most persuasive arguments for Iowa lawmakers to establish a centralized criminal investigation agency, the forerunner of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation that still operates today. In a sense, the 8 victims of that fateful night, indirectly and painfully, helped shape how America investigated crime for the century that followed. Just like the Amityville house or the Borden house we've covered in previous episodes, the small house where the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were murdered still stands in Villisca today. And just like those other two cases, it has been turned into a tourist destination. The house has been restored to look almost exactly as it did in 1912, now open for daytime tours and, for those brave enough, available for overnight rental, letting guests sleep in the very house where 8 people were massacred. No electricity, no modern heating, no amenities beyond oil lamps and candles, exactly as the Moore family would have had it in 1912. A historical authenticity the museum's operators always emphasize in their marketing, but also exactly what makes the experience appealing to people chasing a scare more than a history lesson. No small number of ghost hunter groups and amateur paranormal researchers have spent the night there over the decades, bringing audio recorders and infrared cameras, hoping to capture evidence of spirits still lingering in the house. Stories have circulated for years about children's laughter echoing from empty rooms, the feeling of being touched in the middle of the night, small objects moving on their own. None of it backed by any scientific evidence, but the stories keep getting retold, embellished, and have become an inseparable part of the house's brand, exactly the way things played out at Amityville nearly 60 years later. Amid all the theories, the trials, the data analysis books, and the ghost hunting tours, there are 8 real people with 8 real lives that ended abruptly on a June night in 1912. Josiah Moore, Sarah Moore, Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, Paul, the youngest at 5, and the 2 sisters who came over for a sleepover simply because a fun church evening ran a little longer than planned, Lena Stillinger and Ina, the youngest of them all, who had only had 8 years on this earth. None of them had any enemies. Not one of the 6 children ever did anything to deserve an ending like this. The senseless brutality of the case, the fact that an entire family, plus 2 young guests who just happened to be sleeping over that particular night, all had to die, is exactly what makes it more haunting than any case with a clear motive. If Frank Jones was behind it over a business grudge, why kill all 6 children? If Reverend Kelly did it in some kind of religious psychotic break, why target this specific family? And if the man from the train theory is correct, then all 8 of them were simply unlucky, living in the right house, on the right night, when an anonymous drifter happened to choose that spot as the next stop on his never-ending trail of violence. That's perhaps the core fear the Villisca case leaves behind, a fear entirely different from the ghost story fear the house is now marketed to sell. Not a fear of anything supernatural lurking in the dark, but a very earthly, very human fear that violence sometimes doesn't need a reason at all, just an unlocked door, a long enough night, and a stranger who happened to pass through. The Marked series exists to remember that every time we visit a new marked place, behind every place name that's become marked, there are always real people with real, unfinished lives who deserve to be remembered by their actual names: Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena, and Ina, not just as a body count in a case that was never solved. This is the 3rd episode of the Marked series, and the first where we're telling you about a case that genuinely was never solved, where no one was ever convicted. If you want to follow along to the next marked place, leave a like. See you at the next place.